Current situation, the Palestinian people have essentially been divided up into the massive Palestinian refugee population, and probably prior to what went on, or prior to what is going on in Syria, the largest refugee population in the world. So it's the Palestinian refugees within Palestine itself who were forced from their homes and land in 1948 in the Nakba, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Palestinians in the West Bank, and the Palestinians in Gaza. And certainly the last couple of times I've been there, the real sense of the isolation of the communities from each other is much stronger every time you visit. And just like to give you an example, say you mentioned the ship earlier, Michal, we're barred from entering Israel, so we can't go to the West Bank or Jerusalem, but I can go to Gaza, but it's the same country, but you can't, you know, it's completely separated. So yeah, I want to talk, first about the refugee population. So you have the refugees within Palestine, and then you have thousands of Palestinian refugees, millions, sorry, in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and all over the world. And the conditions that they live in vary from stateless and hugely discriminated against to having some kind of citizenship, say for example in Jordan. And I'm sure you've heard on the news lately about the situation in some of the camps refugee camps in Syria, particularly Yarmouk refugee camp in Damascus, which is under siege by the government forces, and they're in full-scale humanitarian crisis. These camps are mostly populated by Palestinian refugees. Chris Gunness of UNRWA has described, you know, women dying in childbirth. There's been at least 40 fatalities from starvation. Children are suffering from malnutrition, anemia, and rickets. And these people are in that situation because they were expelled from their homes when the State of Israel was founded. And these Palestinian refugees, and all Palestinian refugees, have their right of return guaranteed by UN Resolution 194. The key is really symbolic. You see it everywhere in Palestine, and when you visit people's homes, people have keys or they have deeds to their houses, you know, and the key is like very, very central, and the whole refugee issue is very central to the Palestinian narrative. And while if any Jewish person in the world wants to move to Israel, under their law of return, they can get citizenship, but the Palestinian people are denied their own guaranteed right of return under international law, and their right of return is constantly described as a demographic threat, as, you know, something that would destroy the State of Israel, and totally described in terribly inhumane terms. And certainly when I mentioned the peace process later on, it's part of, they're trying to negotiate away the right of return under the peace process, which would be catastrophic for the Palestinians. So for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, then, there are more than 50 laws, Israeli laws, that discriminate against them in all aspects of life, from political participation, access to land, education, criminal procedures, and state budget resources. Obviously I'm not going to go into 50 laws here, but just to give you a snapshot of some of them. For example, there's an anti-boycott law which prevents any, or forbids any Palestinian citizen, or any Israeli citizen in fact, for promoting the boycott, even against the illegal settlements, and civil lawsuits can be filed against anyone who does call for boycott. In April last year, the Israeli cabinet voted unanimously to extend the family reunification limiting bill, and family reunification is really a terrible situation whereby the Palestinian citizens of Israel, if they're married to someone from the West Bank or from Gaza, and they apply for a unification status for their spouse, for example, this is usually denied to them. And so this is an incredibly racist law, particularly when you posit it against the Israeli law of return, for any Jewish person in the world is allowed to get citizenship. In Jerusalem, there's a Centre of Life policy which tries to deprive the Palestinians of their residency rights, and so they're issued with annual permits to live in Jerusalem. And if you leave there for more than 7 years, even if you've been deported or you move to any other part of the West Bank, you would lose your residency rights, and therefore your right to live in Jerusalem forever. Just a new news came out yesterday that since last month Palestinians are barred from appealing property confiscation in Israeli military court. Palestinians are rarely given permits to build, so you have people who can't extend their houses, and if they do go ahead with it anyway because they can't get the permit, they're subject to demolition. Thousands of homes have been demolished, and you know, some of it is so cruel and, I don't know, Kafkaesque. Like, if your home is being demolished, you have to pay for the demolition. So some people have been forced to demolish their own homes because the cost of demolishing it or paying for the demolition would be worse. If you move on, thank you. If you move on then to the West Bank, for the Palestinians living in the West Bank, they're subject to military checkpoints, military raids, travel restrictions, home demolitions, and the apartheid wall. And this is a photo of a checkpoint where a man died last week of asphyxiation. You know, people are held in. It's astonishing, like when you see them, they're like cages that you wouldn't put, you just wouldn't put human beings in. And people can be held in there for hours. Or you go through these kind of gates like grids. You know, it's just unbelievable. More than half of the land in the West Bank, which a lot of it is very resource-rich, very good agricultural land, is inaccessible to Palestinians. And even actually the World Bank were streaming. I'm no fan of the World Bank, obviously, but they were streaming a kind of a big discussion on this big study they've put out showing the impact of the economic impact of this restricted land, and they put it at worth $3.4 billion per year to the Palestinian economy. So the Area C, which is controlled by Israel, constitutes over 70% of the West Bank and is the only kind of area of connected land in Palestine. And under Oslo, this was supposed to be gradually transferred over to the Palestinian Authority, but this transfer hasn't taken place. So as well as all this, you know, the checkpoints and the military raids and the nighttime raids, etc., the settler violence has really increased lately, and so the Palestinians are under kind of constant attack from settlers, usually with the Israeli soldiers looking on and either taking no action or actually enabling the attacks. And thousands of olive trees have been destroyed, and animals have been killed, and farmers have been attacked. And we had a speaker here last year, Musa Maria, who was talking about how the settlers who live in these massive colonies, you know, I mean, calling them settlements nearly sounds a lot more benign than they are. You know, they spray sewage on their crops every year to try and destroy them, and you know, shepherds are constantly being beaten up, and all this with soldiers looking on. And you know, as well as the soldiers being able to see this is all beside the big colonies. So the watchtowers are there, the cameras, you know, all the stuff that would enable an army to prevent attacks. And this is also this is the full security responsibility of the Israeli army in these areas. So as well as the moral dimension, as the occupying power, Israel has obligations to the Palestinian people as an occupied people to protect them and their property and their territories, but obviously they don't do this. And just as regards courts, I mean, the settlers are rarely prosecuted, but if Palestinians kind of fight back, then obviously they'll be taken away. But there was a case last week where a village rounded up a load of settlers and gave them a few digs. Okay. This, for some reason, I can't show the rest of this, which is a great graphic from Visualizing Palestine. They have brilliant graphics where they kind of show numbers and what's going on, and it's a really good way to kind of just see what's happening. So it shows all the numbers of olive trees that have been uprooted. So if you can look up that website, Visualizing Palestine, it's great. To go on to the wall then, this is a photo I took. This is, the wall was declared illegal by the International Court of Justice in 2004, and as I think we certainly heard from John's talk, international law means very little in situations like this. And the wall is, it's first of all, it's one of the most ugly things I've ever seen in my life, and it's profoundly depressing to look at it and what it means and its implications on people's lives. But it annexes almost 50% of the West Bank and completely destroys any possibility of continuity of life for the Palestinians there. And the kind of propaganda that we're regularly subjected to is that the wall is built on the Green Line and the wall is a security measure, but it's not on the Green Line, and it's not near the Green Line, and in a lot of parts it's like 16 plus kilometres into the West Bank, and annexes these huge settlements and colonies, and there are some Palestinian towns completely encircled by the wall. And for a lot of communities, they're cut off from each other. In a lot of places the wall was just built down the middle of a community and on people's farmland, and what should have been, like, say you had your farm here and this is your farm, and they built this big wall down through it, and you can't get to your animals, so you have to go all around the wall and then go to one of their kind of checkpoints which are arbitrary and have very limited opening and closing times. So it's really it's criminal. This is beside Ida or Dheisheh refugee camp. Yeah, so there's a lot of art and graffiti on it, but behind you can see some of the big settlements. And obviously Gaza is enclosed on the Israeli side also by a big massive wall. I want to go on to talk then very briefly about Palestinian prisoners, because this is a really a very important issue, obviously. Currently there are more than 5,000 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli prisons. Over 200 of them are in administrative detention, which is a situation where you're not charged, you're held on secret charges. Your lawyers aren't allowed to be told what those charges are, so you can't defend yourself because you're under a secret charge. Prisoners in administrative detention are not allowed to go for trial, and the administrative detention orders can be reinstated just in the court all the time. And in the last couple of years, particularly last year, thousands of Palestinian prisoners have gone on hunger strike in protest against the conditions within prisons, and also against administrative detention, including probably the most high-profile case was Mahmoud Sarsak. He was a football player on the Palestinian national football team, and he was abducted by the Israeli military and put in administrative detention. So he went on a hunger strike, and he was eventually released. Hopefully we will have him speaking here this year. There are up to 700 Palestinian children under the age of 18 are prosecuted every year through Israeli military courts after being arrested, interrogated and detained by the Israeli army. And the most common charge levied against them is stone throwing, which can be punishable by military law by up to 20 years in prison. Since the year 2000, more than 8,000 Palestinian children have been detained, and these kids are routinely taken out of their homes in at night. These terrifying night raids, heavily militarized, people with guns and lights, and they're taken out away from their families. They're not allowed access to legal representation or to their families. The children are often held in isolation, and there have been a lot of reports lately on torture of children in prisons. The most recent reports on it were from Defence for Children International, and then Adamir, the Palestinian Prisoners' Rights Association, and B'Tselem and various other human rights organisations have talked about this. And in another kind of example of Israeli apartheid, Palestinian children, the age of criminal responsibility for them is 12, and they can, from the age of 14, they can be imprisoned for up to 6 months, which is just an astonishing thing. Okay. I have a lot to get through and I'm nearly there. So I just wanted to go on and talk about Gaza. And really, the pictures I painted of the rest of Palestine are pretty grim, but the situation in Gaza is absolutely dire at the moment, and it's in the throes of a full-scale man-made humanitarian disaster. In November last year, the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator called for urgent action to address this humanitarian crisis in Gaza, because Gaza's only power plant shut down due to fuel shortages, and the people in Gaza now have maybe between 4 and 6 hours of electricity per day. That's it. So obviously, as well as affecting your ability to have as much of a normal life as you can under a siege, you know, people have to get up in the middle of the night to avail of electricity, to wash clothes, to try and study. But this has terrible effects on the hospitals, particularly dialysis patients, babies in incubators, etc. And the water and the sewage systems. And I don't know if you saw, like last December, there were terrible floods and snowstorms all over the Middle East. But in Gaza, because the drainage system is completely not working, non-functional, the streets were flooded, like people were going around in boats. But not only were they flooded with water, they were flooded with raw sewage, because the water treatment plant doesn't work. So people were, you know, just in this, no electricity, no heating, flooded everywhere with sewage, getting around in boats, and, you know, completely surrounded, and they can't get in or out. So it's a really chronic situation. You know, the medical supplies, as many of the Gaza Ministry for Health has said, as many as 40% of medical supplies are at zero stock level. So the Israeli siege is terrible, and then this is being compounded by the new regime in Egypt, and they've shut down most of the tunnels, and the tunnels were kind of the only way to bring through a lot of the fuel and the food staples and the things that are banned by Israel. The unemployment is over 40%, 80% of families are aid dependent, and your freedom of movement of people is completely at the whim of Israel and of Egypt. And it's so pervasive, the siege, like you can't, the only ways to get in or out are through Erez on the Israeli side or through Rafah on the Egyptian side. Erez, forget about it for most people unless they work for NGOs, and even those, it depends which one. On the Egyptian side, since this more recent government, Rafah has often been closed for days at a time. We've had situations of hundreds of people just having to sleep at Rafah, and even if you get through Rafah, you know, you've got the Sinai to cross, which is like 8 hours of, you know, very unstable and very possibly unsafe situation at the moment, particularly for the Palestinians, because they're being very demonized in the Egyptian press. So, you know, there were loads of students this year who had scholarships to get out of Gaza, people we've been in contact with, and only a few of them were able to get out. They were just prevented from leaving. So, as well as all this, this was a picture of a man taking his kids through the sewage flooded streets. I just think, it's just amazing. And this was, so as well as all of this, the best agricultural land in Gaza is zoned in the buffer zone by Israel. So when farmers try and go and farm their land, does that mean 20 minutes? Or does someone just get a text message? Sorry. They're regularly shot at and regularly killed. And the Palestinian fishing community, we met with them last year, and their situation is really, really dire. Their industry has been decimated by more than 60% in the last few years, and they're supposed to be allowed to fish up to 20 miles out of the coast. Of course they should be allowed to fish wherever they want, but under Oslo it's supposed to be 20 miles out, but they're limited now to even 3 miles out, and the sea is completely polluted because the sewage goes straight in there. And this was a fisherman we met. He was showing us his scar on his stomach. He'd been shot by the Israeli Navy and his boat was impounded. But this man beside him, he had been shot, his boat was trashed, and they kidnapped him, they brought him to prison in Israel. He got no medical treatment for 7 days. He was in prison in Israel, and then they just dumped him on the side of the road, and he had to crawl back through the buffer zone into Gaza. Just incredible, and these are just people trying to fish and feed their families. So, you know, this situation is absolutely unacceptable. So the peace process I'm not really going to spend much time on, because the only thing I can say about the peace process is it frightens me, because so many Palestinian rights are being negotiated away, but the narrative that you hear is, oh yeah, well maybe there's some progress being made or whatever. And I thought this was a great quote from years ago from Edward Said, because always the responsibility is on the Palestinians. You know, what are they going to concede more? What are they going to recognise about Israel? So I think this is a very telling comment. But just about the negotiations will involve no control over borders for the Palestinians. They lose even more parts of their supposed promised state. The settlements may freeze but will probably continue. You still have the bypass roads. East Jerusalem wouldn't be the capital, so you just have people living in a kind of a series of apartheid Bantustans, which I'm sure would suit Israel fine. So, fine, nearly, oh yeah, this is just like a lot of the, facts on the, again, this is a lot more information, but just on, the notion that the peace process is good, like, under Oslo, things became much, much worse for the Palestinians in terms of expulsions, home demolitions, settlement construction, etc. Okay. Yeah, so I want to then move away from the kind of very grim to what's happening then to kind of counter this. And anyone who's been to Palestine will tell you for sure that the most impressive and I suppose inspirational thing is the people are just incredible, and I don't mean that in any patronizing way, but they're just their will to keep going and their just strength of character is phenomenal, and I really felt that in Gaza especially. And there's an expression which is to exist is to resist, and I think that's really why they keep going, because I don't think anyone else could withstand this unless you had this incredible sort of collective samud and strength of character. So just as regards, I mentioned the wall earlier, in a lot of villages in Palestine, in Bilain and Nilain, Nabi Saleh, Kafur, Kadam, every Friday there are these big demonstrations against the wall with obviously all the local villagers, the few Israeli anarchists against the wall, and internationals go along, and there's usually a few politicians or journalists there as well, and these are met with tear gas, this filthy skunk water that they spray at you, which is the worst smell in the world and doesn't leave you, and rubber coated steel bullets or actual bullets. And the one I was at in Bilain, this is what they fired at people, so someone picked those up that day. So people have been killed there, and they particularly have been very violent in Nabi Saleh, and in fact Tommy Donnellan was shot twice there in the last while. So moving on then to the BDS campaign, which is the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign, the call for which came in 2005 in the light of the international community's failure to act on the International Court of Justice ruling on the wall. And the BDS campaign is kind of modelled on the South African anti-apartheid campaign, and it takes the form of a consumer, an academic, a cultural, a sporting boycott, a divestment programme, and a call for sanctions on Israel. So the consumer boycott, I guess, is something we can all participate in by not buying Israeli products. But more than that, you should complain about this stuff if you see it in shops, and just let them know that, you don't want to see this stuff. With the consumer stuff and the divestment campaign, there's been a lot of success in the last while with big companies. For example, Veolia, the wastewater company, they've lost 18 billion in contracts. How am I for time? In the last few years, okay. Just last week, one of the largest pension fund administrators in Europe, PGGM, they're Dutch, announced it would divest from 5 Israeli banks over their activity in the occupied West Bank. There's big campaigns around G4S, which are a company we should talk about for a million reasons anyway, because they're terrible, but they also service the Israeli prison service. There's a campaign against Israeli blood diamonds, which Sean is the spearhead of. And in Ireland, we've had a kind of long-standing campaign against Cement Roadstone Holdings for their building of the wall, but we've had a complaint with the OECD for a few years, and they haven't gone anywhere with it, and even they said last November that they would get back to us in January with updates on where they're going, but they haven't gone anywhere. The cultural boycott, in Ireland there's an artist boycott pledge, which over 200 plus Irish artists have signed up to refuse to go to Israel. And funny, Riverdance is on in UL at the moment, and Riverdance played in Israel despite a massive campaign here. asking them not to go. But Robert Balla designed the set for Riverdance, so he didn't want his sets going, but he, legally he couldn't get out of it. So he gave us the money from the royalties for that tour for the ship. But there has been a lot of success with the cultural boycott. A lot of bands have cancelled. Faithless, Elvis Costello, Ken Loach, Gorillaz, Cat Power, Cassandra Wilson, Massive Attack, etc. Mira Nair, the film director last year. But the boycott really got pushed into the mainstream with Professor Stephen Hawking joining last year, and that really, really rattled them because, he's the most intelligent person in the world and he's the most yes. So even when bands do play and the BDS campaign, contacting them is unsuccessful, I think it's still successful because the boycott is discussed all the time and it's more and more mainstream. Like when Rihanna played last summer, Variety magazine did a big, now it wasn't a great piece about the boycott, they got a lot wrong, but it was in Variety magazine, so it's gone into the mainstream media a lot more, whereas it used to be a lot more marginalised. Very quickly moving on to the academic boycott. The Teachers Union of Ireland last year became the first union in Europe to endorse the academic boycott of Israel, for which they're still receiving insane hate mail and being called all sorts of terrible names. But the motion was very strong. It referred to Israel as an apartheid state and called for a cessation of all collaboration with Israel and Israeli institutions. And if anyone is interested in joining the academic boycott, please talk to us afterwards. And then just before Christmas, the American Studies Association voted to boycott Israel, and this is huge because it's in the States, and however skewed and terrible our media is, the media there is much worse, and this has really rattled the Israelis to the point that Tippi Livni, arch war criminal and current Israeli Minister for Justice, she warned the other day, the boycott is moving and advancing uniformly and exponentially. Those who don't want to see it will end up feeling it.